Welcome back. Infrastructure. You have heard the word tossed about with the concern that we need to fix it. But exactly what are they talking about and just how dire is the need? Well, have no fear. We will explain.
Well, we've reported on, I believe it's the Association of American Civil Engineers who grade American infrastructure every year. And we've had a lousy grade. And the sad part is the D- that they graded for last year was actually an improvement. And
No,
that's
C- from last year.
Was it a C-?
Yeah, because it's always been the D range.
Yeah, and it got up, and that's
Upgraded
still
to C-
terrible
in some areas.
So let's start with the conversation of traditional infrastructure, and then let's take it a little bit further and talk about infrastructure today.
Yeah, because they might say, Ken, there's only like 10 or 15% is going to roads and bridges in this infrastructure bill.
Yeah, because one, and we've reported on this, that the way that government funding works tends to promote building new roads and new highways and new bridges and doesn't offer money to fix the ones they've already built. So that's a problem. Now, we're talking about traditional infrastructure was highways, bridges, airports, railways, marine, which would include lock and dams. And I don't think people realize that in our navigatable rivers, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers operates, maintains, and upgrades. Like the Mississippi, that's commerce. That is commerce. All those locks and dams are operated by the Army Corps of Engineers.
Something like one shipping boat in there is like 100 trucks.
Yeah,
like
and
across.
that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of dams across navigatable waters that the Army Corps also maintains. There's a lot of that people don't talk about that have not had money spent on them in a very long time. And in fact, I remember a report a few years back that talked about the need to replace, not repair, replace the lock and dam system up and down the Mississippi River, and the price tag alone was in the, I believe, if not the high billions, it was in the low trillions.
And it takes like 10 years.
Yeah.
It's just, it's time consuming. And
absolutely.
Not something you can do immediately.
So, folks, that's the traditional infrastructure, and it needs help. Let's talk about what infrastructure also includes today. The power grid, your electrical grid. You don't believe me? Ask the folks in Texas. That our grid has gotten old. It can't support everything that it needs to do. Smart grid needs to be a nationwide thing, not just for EVs, but power generation, hardening and protecting it from being hacked and maybe taken over with by bad actors and nefarious people who will do bad things that could really mess up the economy. That needs to change. The ability for the grid to work smarter, to work better, to be more efficient than it's been. Parts of this grid are approaching, and I'm not exaggerating, 100 years old. That's ridiculous.
About clean water.
Absolutely. Flint, Michigan, enough said. You know, the EPA regulates 85 different contaminants in water. And I didn't even know that till I did some research on a show that I did a number of years ago about clean water. Yes, you're absolutely right, with lead being one of the lead problems. Mm-hmm. But we're still not done. When we've talked about this off air, high-speed broadband internet access.
It's something like 30% of people don't have access to consistent high-speed internet.
This country needs the equivalent of what we did almost 100 years ago to get electricity and phone service to the rural parts of our country. The federal government created associations and commissions that made low-interest loans available, that made grants available, because let's be brutally honest, it was not economically feasible for a privately owned company to spend the capital expenditures necessary to bring those services to sparsely populated areas of our country. Yet, these small cities and towns and these farms and otherwise can't even be competitive today without that kind of infrastructure. It is totally an embarrassment that we still have large swaths, not just our country, our state is still got wide paths, and we are predominantly a rural state. And there are wide parts of the state that don't have it. Dial-up is so almost 30 years ago, yet People barely have better than that in some parts of this country. There's no excuse for that.
Absolutely.
Absolutely no excuse. So there's that also to consider. That needs modernization. The problem is we've been coasting for so long, and we've taken such a narrow view of infrastructure for so long that we haven't kept up with the necessary investments. So now, in order to catch up, the administration is talking this big number, and it is a big number.
Over 10 years, which is important.
15, but
15,
that's okay.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But here's the problem. That's just a down payment.
Yeah.
That's not going to fix the problem.
And you don't see the returns this can give us, too. And you can end up saving money in the long run, potentially, too, in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely. Think about this. If farmers in our rural parts of the country were better connected to the internet, they could get better prices for their grain. That means, and better prices for the commodities that they need to buy to run their operations. That alone, making a farmer more efficient, makes a community stronger and helps that whole economic infrastructure. Small businesses in small cities and towns can now be more competitive. It gives people a chance to live places where they can afford to live rather than having to live closer because they don't have internet access. Telemedicine can happen in places where it is not economically feasible for medical professionals, specialists to set up shop. There's a whole bunch of things when you talk about benefits and good that happen. Plus, we're looking at this big picture of how we're on the cusp of major changes in our transportation, whether it's EVs or autonomous vehicles or different modes, a resurgence of cycling, rails to trails, a whole bunch of other things going on that need our attention and are worthy of our concerns. Sidewalks.
Yeah.
Sidewalks. Sidewalks. Practical, usable sidewalks to get from point A to point B by walking. Not for exercise, but to run errands.
And while there's been a lot of jokes about the fluctuating definition of infrastructure, someone said this, and I don't know if it's true. I didn't look into it. But at one point in time, railroads were not considered infrastructure. Like in its origin, they tried to push back on that as a mode of infrastructure to put money towards. So it's kind of interesting how definitions of infrastructure have been changing throughout our history.
And I'm going to help folks with that. Everything that comes into a port into this country gets hauled out not just by truck, but if it's going halfway across the country, it's going by railroad. You see the container, these high, fast manifest trains that guarantee from the Port of Long Beach to Chicago, 48 hours. That's what, about 1,800 miles. 2 days, 1,800 miles. And those suckers are rolling. They have the highest priority in the railroad. And it affects everything because being a global economy that we are, we get goods from all over the place. Again, don't believe me? 2 words, Suez Canal. And the container ship that got stuck. And we will still be feeling the effects halfway around the world because it jammed up a lot of ships that couldn't get through. Infrastructure. It's not just roads and bridges. We talked about marine. We talked about railroads. We've talked about the electrical grid. We've talked about internet access. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. If the feds won't...